Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this online event to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. And the Lytton Phil is deeply honoured to have Monica Stern with us today. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Harris Clark, who will introduce Monica. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. For those, I know several people on the site already know Monica, but for those of you who don't, you might like to know that Monica was born in Gateshead in 1955. Both her parents came to England in 1939 as children fleeing from Nazi persecution. The family moved to Gosforth in 1960, and Monica attended Central High School until she was 18. Her education continued at the Loble Institute, a teacher's training college near Richmond in Surrey. Monica and her husband Gerald, she says, have known each other since before they were born. His parents were also victims of Nazi oppression. Monica and Gerald brought up their two children in Gosforth, and Monica worked with Gerald in the family business until it was sold in 2003. Having lived in Newcastle for 66 years, they recently moved to Hertfordshire to be closer to their children and grandchildren. Brought up in the shadow of the Holocaust, Monica appreciated the opportunity to speak about her family's persecution at the hands not only of the Nazis, but also their former friends, neighbours and business colleagues. Monica says this is the first time that she had been at the Lytton Phil since she came here to study for her A-levels in 1973. I'll hand over you now to Monica, who will speak to you.
Thank you very much, Harris, and thank you for that one. And of course, we were going to be at the Lytton Phil, and it would have been the first time in 50 years that I'd been there, which would have been very nice. But because of health concerns and COVID, we decided to go virtual, and it's lovely to see so many of you. And of course, more people can attend this way than if we've been all together in one room, and it's much safer. You may think that this year's HMD theme of one day is a simple guide for speakers to concentrate on one day. It is actually a brilliant way of enabling us to talk about the immense, tragic, and unimaginable atrocities which occurred as a result of one seismic day. We all know that Germany was vanquished in the First World War. The 1920s were not good years for Germany. The government were paying huge sums of restitution to Britain and its allies. Unemployment was high, and many Germans were living in abject poverty. Thus, Hitler vilified the Jews for causing Germany's problems and used them as a scapegoat. There had been a Jewish community in Germany for hundreds of years, and my family had lived there for many generations. My father, George Loble, but then called Günther, lived in Bamberg, Bavaria, with his parents Fritz and Elsa Loble, and his brothers Willi and Rudi. Bamberg is a pretty medieval town at the confluence of the rivers Regnitz and Main. There are many timbered buildings and winding cobbled streets, and a beautifully embellished town hall on a tiny island. Bamberg was known for its beer made from locally grown hops. Several family members were hop merchants in the area. In 1933, there were about 500,000 Jews in Germany, twice as many as live in the UK today. Jewish children went to mainstream schools and were friends with Christian children. Jews and Gentiles worked and played together, just as it should be. Between 1901 and 1933, there had been 37 Nobel Prize winners, 11 of whom were Jewish. German Jews had fought for their homeland in the Great War. Many had paid the ultimate price, including my great-grandfather, Wilhelm Fried, who was killed in action in April 1916. However, relatively few had been awarded medals for bravery. My grandfather Fritz received the Iron Cross, first-class and second-class medals, as well as a medal for bravery as he was wounded in battle. He also received the Bavarian Military Medal with Crossed Swords from Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, President of the Weimar Republic. Support for the Nazi Party increased exponentially in the early 1930s. They gained 18% of the vote in September 1930 and became the second largest party. 37% in 1932 made them the largest political party in Germany, and by Monday, the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. So in keeping with this year's HMD theme, this is my one day, the day after which the German people were systematically whipped up into a frenzy of hate and cruelty which could never have been foreseen. After all, Germany was a civilized country which had given the world Karl Marx, Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, Beethoven, Dürer and Marlene Dietrich, great thinkers, composers, artists and film stars. Starting in 1933, Hitler used a combination of deception and violence to force the Reichstag to do his bidding and surrender all power to him. Hitler defined the Nazi Party foreign policy, the prime goal being to secure Lebensraum, living space, for a German master race. On March the 26th, 1933, Hitler declared that there would be a one-day nationwide boycott of Jewish businessmen and professionals. In one stroke, this dealt a terrible blow to the Jewish community. The edict was presented to the outside world as a legitimate response to Jewish lies about German anti-Semitic violence. His threats included, "I shall no longer be able to vouch for the safety of German Jews." In the end, the boycott was called off after only one day. However, in the following weeks and months, Jews were increasingly in danger, and little by little, they were excluded from the everyday life they had always known. 1933 rolled on, with many ominous changes for German Jewish citizens. Many already saw the writing on the wall and made plans to leave. Many couldn't afford to, and others buried their head in the sand. With the Enabling Act, Hitler gave himself power to make laws without consulting the Reichstag for a period of 4 years. He merged the role of Chancellor and President and banned all other political parties. By August 1934, Hitler had become the self-appointed Führer and was in complete control of Germany. The Gestapo was formed, the Nazi Party took over local government, trade unions were banned. You can see where this was going. In April 1935, Jehovah's Witnesses were outlawed, and after 28th of June, the systematic persecution of homosexual men was encouraged. Much of the persecution of Jews and other undesirables is generally known, but detailed consequences of laws passed may not be. These new laws made life very difficult. Of course, the adults became well aware of the implications, but the children couldn't understand why their lives had changed so radically. Having learned to swim in the local public swimming pool, my father and his brothers had to find somewhere else to swim in a secluded part of the river away from the town, as they were considered dirty and would contaminate the water in the pool. My father was no longer permitted to attend school, so his education continued at the Jewish Community Center, along with all of the other Jewish children. Joseph Goebbels gave a speech in Berlin stating, "The era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end. The future German man will not just be a man of books, but a man of character. It is to this end that we want to educate you." He then decreed that all books and periodicals considered un-German should be publicly burned. How prophetic then that the 19th century writer, German writer, Heinrich Heine wrote, where one burns books, one will so soon burn people. The Nuremberg Laws were anti-Semitic and racist laws that were enacted on the 15th of September 1935 at a special meeting of the Reichstag, convened during the annual Nuremberg rally of the Nazi Party. With shocking speed and efficiency, the Nazis began to implement their new policies, which included the formation of a Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, based on race. These policies defined the enemy and those who posed a threat to the so-called Aryan race. Hitler wanted to create a master race, a nation of blonde, blue-eyed, strong and healthy citizens. They would be biologically superior, socially productive, and loyal to the state. Which is rather curious, as Hitler was short, dark-haired, and of dubious parentage. It has been suggested that his parents were distantly related, and that he may have had more than a few drops of Jewish and African blood in his heritage. Sorry. The Nazis went to great lengths to identify the Jews. There was a handbook illustrating typical traits to look out for: large hooked noses, eyes set close together, large ears, a certain head shape, and a particular demeanor and gait. My father recalled that the music teacher at his school began to verbally abuse the Jewish children. He accused anyone who sang a wrong note of having Jewish ears. Some of the children sat in silence, embarrassed, but others laughed and were encouraged to jeer at their Jewish classmates. The teacher's approval emboldened them, and they continued to taunt the Jewish children outside of school as well. An additional number of groups were targeted as enemies or outsiders. They included the Roma people, homosexuals, political dissidents. Also identified were people regarded as genetically inferior, such as people with Down syndrome, people with mental illness, and people with physical disabilities. They were considered unimportant and unworthy of life. Of course, Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, took this opportunity to perform deadly experiments on many of the prisoners in Auschwitz. In the name of medical research, he inflicted unimaginable pain on his victims, most of whom died from their wounds. In his quest for racial purity, Hitler encouraged young German women to have sexual intercourse with SS officers as part of a state-supported program called Lebensborn, Fountain of Life, with the aim of producing perfect Aryan babies. These campaigns to isolate non-Aryan citizens incited hatred within the general population and were particularly effective in creating an atmosphere where violence was tolerated, even encouraged. The law of protecting German blood and German honor was enshrined under the Nuremberg Laws. Relationships between those of pure German blood and those outside this parameter were prohibited. The German purity of all ancestors born since 1750 had to be proved through baptismal records. Mischlinge, mixlings, people who had even a small amount of Jewish blood, were also persecuted. These laws forbade marriages between the two groups and the employment of German females aged under 45 in Jewish households. In addition, the new Reich citizenship law declared that only those of pure German blood were eligible to be citizens of the Reich. The remainder were classed as state subjects, but without any rights. Passports were cancelled, making travel virtually impossible. By 1938, in an attempt to rid Germany of its Jews, passports were issued. But for easy identification, all Jewish men were given the middle name Israel, and all Jewish women, Sarah. They also had a large red J stamped on their passports. This also made it more difficult for Jews fleeing the repressive regime to gain entry into other countries. In order to leave Germany, Jews were required to remit up to 90% of their wealth as Judensteuer, Jew tax. The 1936 Olympic Games were held in Berlin. This international event offered Hitler the perfect opportunity to showcase the Third Reich. For the first time in the history of the Olympics, having heard rumors of the way things were going in Nazi Germany, America and many countries in Europe called for a boycott of the Games. Unfortunately, these protests narrowly failed and the Games went ahead as planned. The Nazis made every effort to create an air of normality before foreign dignitaries and international press arrived. All anti-Jewish and racist signs, such as "Jews not welcome here," were removed. This fooled everyone, and Hitler's regime became legitimized in the eyes of the world. The Nuremberg Laws had a crippling economic and social impact on the Jewish community. Jewish citizens were harassed and subjected to violent attacks. Former friends denounced their Jewish neighbors and clapped and jeered when they were led from their homes and deported in cattle trucks to their deaths. Jews were actively oppressed, stripped of their citizenship and civil rights, and were eventually completely ostracized from German society. Non-Jews gradually stopped socializing with Jews. They no longer shopped in Jewish-owned stores, many of which went out of business due to lack of customers. As Jews were no longer permitted to work in the civil service or government-regulated professions, such as medicine and education, many middle-class business owners and professionals were forced to take menial employment. I was asked to make this presentation to follow in the footsteps of my late father, George Loble. Many of you knew him, liked him, and deeply respected him. George was 6 when Hitler came to power. His brothers, Willy and Rudy, were 12 and 10. The Loble boys went to the local state school in Bamberg. Other family members lived in the same street, so the boys had several cousins nearby to play with. This was especially important as their friends were forbidden by the Nazis to mix with them. My grandfather and his youngest brother, Robert, ran the family's manufacturing business founded by their father, Hugo Loble. They employed around 300 people. They were good to their staff. The family's housemaid, Babette, was Catholic, and as she only ate fish on Fridays, so did the Lobles. She was given time off to go to church and was generally treated with respect by the family. The chauffeur at the family business was very well treated by the company and by the family, as I said. As soon as things became difficult for the company, he was appointed a local Nazi representative, and he purloined the family and the company car for himself, thinking that the family would no longer need it, and of course they didn't. My grandmother regularly met her Kaffeeklatsch, a group of Jewish and non-Jewish friends, for coffee and cake at a cafe in the nearby park. So you can see that the family was totally socially integrated within Bamberg society. On the 7th of November 1938, Herschel Greenspan, a Polish Jewish refugee living in Paris, walked into the German embassy and assassinated the German Nazi diplomat Ernst vom Rath. This was used as justification for the violent anti-Semitic pogrom which was unleashed throughout Germany and which will forever be known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. That night, my father and his family found themselves under siege in their own home. Although they were well known in the neighborhood, their windows were smashed and their shutters were daubed with anti-Semitic slogans. As it was winter and the heavy curtains were drawn, they were protected from being injured by flying glass. The following morning, the Loble household was loudly woken at dawn by Willy. He was my father's eldest brother and was getting ready to go to work as an engineering apprentice. As he looked out of the window, he could see flames in the darkness and realized that the synagogue was on fire. My grandfather told everyone to stay quiet and stay at home, out of sight, and he asked Babette to go out into the street and see what was happening. She returned and reported that the Gestapo were marching up the street, arresting all Jewish men. Shortly afterwards, there was a bang on the door, and my grandfather was taken away, leaving my grandmother and her 3 sons behind, terrified of what might happen next. In Bamberg, 81 Jewish men were rounded up that night and held in temporary custody in the district prison. The next day, they were transferred by train to Dachau, a concentration camp 140 miles away. My grandfather Fritz and his brother Robert were the only 2 Jewish men in Bamberg who were not actually arrested. They had the foresight to don their First World War medals, and as they were taken away, they proudly wore their medals affixed to their coats in the hope that their service to Germany in the First World War might make a difference to their fate. When they arrived at Gestapo headquarters, they were taken to the commander, who recognized them, and after thorough interrogation, they were released early the next morning. They were advised to head home as quickly as possible and to keep to side roads and the shadows, because their safety could not be guaranteed if they were caught. However, their brother Sali was not so lucky. He was detained and tortured in Dachau for 3 weeks, with the grinding uncertainty as to what would become of him. During that night, the director of the Bamberg Jewish community risked his life by going to the synagogue to save the Torah scrolls. He was beaten up, and the baying crowd went to his home, threw his furniture out of the windows of his first-floor apartment into the street. He died a few weeks later from the injuries he sustained that night. After Kristallnacht, no Jew in Germany was in any doubt about what the future held for them. During that terrible night, many Jews were murdered, thousands were beaten up, and over 30,000 taken to concentration camps. Scarcely a Jewish shop, office, or synagogue survived looting, burning, desecration, or severe damage in the ensuing rampage, not only by Hitler's henchmen, but also by emboldened ordinary citizens. Jewish homes had been rendered uninhabitable, and Jewish businesses sold under duress for a paltry sum in order for their owners to be released from Dachau or concentration camps. In order to be able to leave the country, they had to pay punitive taxes from blocked bank accounts. My 2 great-grandmothers, Lena Loble and Betty Fried, were taken to the newly designated Jewish ghetto at the former Bamberg Jewish Community Center. Large sums of money were taken from their blocked bank accounts by the Nazis. The elderly ladies were led to believe that they were heading to a care home. You can imagine, the image you were looking at was the contract for their care in Theresienstadt, a transit camp from which they were deported and murdered in Treblinka on the 26th of September, 1942. In his book, The Boy from Bamberg, my father wrote, "From Kristallnacht until the time I crossed the German-Dutch border by train in March 1939, I lived in constant fear. It is unimaginable to live in a country which is not only lawless, but one which actually encourages persecution of minority groups. The feeling of anxiety and at times terror never leaves you." He was 12 at the time. George passed away in February 2021. He vividly remembered Kristallnacht to the very end of his long life. His memories of those early years were instrumental in the adult he became. He was eternally thankful that Britain gave his family safe refuge from persecution and the opportunity to build a new life. Even when he was a young married man, running the family business in Gateshead and looking after his elderly mother and young family, George sought to give back to society. He volunteered with many charities, joined the Rotary Club, and became a magistrate. The day that Hitler came to power altered the course of the history of the world. As a result of his ideology, over 75 million people died. Not just those who didn't fit into the idea of an Aryan nation, but huge numbers of innocent civilians and military personnel in many countries fighting to vanquish the Nazi foe. Hitler implemented his racist laws at the perfect time. Germany was suffering from high unemployment and economic depression. Von Hindenburg was weak and a remnant of the glorious days of the German Empire. Hitler was loud and charismatic, and the people needed a leader who was strong and who would make Germany great again. Ordinary citizens were complicit in Hitler's dangerous policies against their friends, business colleagues, and neighbors, just because they were Jewish. Many were given power for the first time, and the punishment and eventual extermination of Jewish vermin was doled out with relish. If more people had made a stand and refused to implement these laws, the outcome would have been very different. There are lessons to be learned. How often have we heard, never again? But there are still many regimes who cruelly persecute minorities in their countries, and the general population just don't seem able to stand up against them. In my opinion, the best way is education directed to as wide an audience as possible. Before the Holocaust, the world Jewish population was around 16 million. It is well documented that around 6 million Jews died or were murdered under Nazi tyranny. 1.6 million were children. My late father-in-law, Freddie Stern, lost all of his immediate family in the Holocaust. He was an only child, and he fled his home in Montabaur, Germany, on the Kindertransport, aged just 13. He never saw his parents or his grandparents again. So my husband Gerald had no aunts, uncles, cousins, or grandparents. When he retired, he set about trying to find more distant relatives and to research what happened to those that had managed to escape. As a result, he now has a database with 20,000 names of our forebears dating back to 1380, all in Germany within its various borders and within its various ever-changing borders. Despite Hitler's desire to rid the world of Jews, and although we lost many members of our family in the Holocaust, several of our relatives did manage to escape, and their descendants settled and have thrived all over the world. It was by no means easy. As I mentioned before, Jews had their passports rescinded, and when they were reissued, the large red J stamp made it much more difficult to enter many countries. Hundreds of European Jews were relieved as they boarded ships bound for freedom. Sadly, several of these vessels were not permitted to disembark their passengers in the United States, South America, and Cuba. The ships were turned around and sent back to Europe, where many of those hopeful refugees perished. I have already mentioned my grandfather Loble's brother, Sali. He and his wife managed to get places on the Kindertransport for their two children, Erica and Werner. They saw them off on their journey to London in the hope that their lives would be saved. As soon as the children were safely out of Germany, Sally and Friedel managed to get visas and embarked on a treacherous route through war-torn Russia and China and on to Japan. From there, they crossed the Pacific Ocean, surviving all the dangers of maritime battles between the Japanese and the Americans, eventually safely arriving in Ecuador. Once settled, they called for Erica, by then 18, and Werner, 16, to join them from England. Of course, that voyage was no less perilous, as they had to cross the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats, hoping to scupper any enemy ship that they could. Tragically, Sally died in Ecuador on D-Day, the 6th of June, 1945, probably from the lasting effects of torture in Dachau, as well as the effects of the difficult journey to safety. My dad remained extremely close to his first cousin, Werner, who has lived in Israel since 1965. As retirees, the two cousins and their wives regularly went on holiday together and latterly kept in touch with each other through FaceTime. My mother's parents, Fritz and Trude Heinemann, had already taken the decision to move to Holland in 1935. But after Kristallnacht, my grandfather feared this was not far enough. So they came to England in 1938. One of his brothers, Hugo, traveled back to Germany for a bar mitzvah, but was arrested, deported, and murdered at Auschwitz in February 1943. His other brother, Walter, remained in Holland, but when the Nazis attacked and occupied the country, he was arrested, sent to Westerbork concentration camp, and was murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. Miraculously, their father, Joseph, my great-grandfather, survived Westerbork and Theresienstadt and ended his days in Northwood, Middlesex in 1951. I say miraculously because Joseph was 70 in 1939. Typically, the Nazis found no use for elderly people, and they were mostly disposed of without a thought as to how they had served their country. They were either shot on the spot or transported to transit camps and onto death camps where they died in the gas chambers. My grandmother, Elsa Loble, had two brothers, Karl and Stefan, both of whom were born in Bamberg. Stefan managed to emigrate to America and Karl escaped to Sao Paulo in Brazil. His children and grandchildren now live in various parts of the United States. We and our children are in touch with several of them, and we are especially close with Stefan's offspring. My late mother, Eve, remained very close to her first cousin, Lottie, who lived in Belgium until 2018. At the tender age of 90, she decided to move to Israel to be closer to her sister Ursel, who had been there since the 1950s. Very sadly, Ursel only passed away just last week. And what about Jewish Germany today? Despite the deadly blow dealt to European Jews, a few did return to Germany. Many Jews in the diaspora could never bring themselves to buy German cars or luxury goods, but others returned to places they remembered fondly from the good old days. I could never understand how my grandmother Elsa could return to Germany for holidays. After all, her mother had been persecuted there and murdered by the Germans. Today, there are over 200,000 Jews in Germany, almost as many as in the UK. Only 15,000 Jews survived the Holocaust in Europe. Some had been in hiding, others were liberated from concentration camps by the Allies. The World Jewish Congress met in 1948, and Rabbi Leo Beck declared that the history of Jews in Germany has found its end. The resettlement of Germany by Jews was unthinkable. However, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, thousands of Jewish immigrants went to Germany from the former Soviet Union. In 1999, Gerald and I took our children to Bamberg to show them where the family had come from. We went to the synagogue on Friday evening. And immediately noticed that almost everyone was speaking Russian. The young girlies in the powder room were giggling, applying their lipstick and yakking in Russian. The service was in German and Hebrew, but we had to sit through the sermon twice, being delivered in two languages we did not understand, German and Russian. Over the past decade, amazingly, Berlin has become one of the most desirable destinations among Israelis who live abroad. So despite Hitler's plan to rid the world of Jews, there are Jews in Germany once again. And the world Jewish population, 90 years later, has regenerated and is now about the same as it was before that one day in 1933. I do hope that you found this presentation interesting and that you've learned something new. If you're interested in reading my father's biography, you can download this free of charge. Please make a note of the web address here on the screen. I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Monica. A lot to think about and digest there, but if anybody has any questions or comments, please do go ahead. Monica, how did it feel for you going to Bamberg?
Yes,
Monica,
well,
sorry, I'll ask afterwards.
That's a good one. We also found it very difficult to go back to Germany, but because we were trying to do family research with Gerald's project, we did go back to Germany. And of course, we were sitting in the restaurants and in the streets and looking at older men and thinking, you know, what did you do to the Jews and others during those times? Because and yet I felt some sort of comfort, kinship, whatever it was, by being in Germany. We had familiar family food, the food we had in the family in restaurants. There was something there that it's very difficult to explain. We made the effort, Gerald made the particular effort to get memorials put up in the towns where his father and grandparents, great-grandparents had lived. And we found a certain amount of resistance when we went to speak to the local councils, because the councillors in those little towns still asked uncomfortable questions, why it was necessary, and couldn't we just put the memorial in the Jewish cemetery, you know, for Jews to go and visit. And the whole point was, it wasn't for the Jews to revisit, it was for the Germans living there today to remind them of, you know, that it should never happen again. And but eventually these memorials were put in, well, one of them was put in front of the Civic Centre in Montabaur, where my father-in-law was from. And we suddenly started to feel a little bit different. So, you know, and as I mentioned, you know,
I'm not driving.
Right, you just go. You won't see me because we're going to be late.
Don't be stupid.
Our grandmother kept going back to Germany. You know, she went to visit the doctor who'd looked after them in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which was sort of in the mountains, and to this holiday place that they'd all gone to in former times. And, you know, we found that very difficult to understand, but latterly we sort of did understand, you know, how it was for them. It had been their home and they had happy times there.
Thank you.
Monica?
Yes. Who's speaking? I can't see who's speaking.
Sarah. My
It's
name's
Anthony.
Sarah, Monica.
Hello, Sarah. Hi.
Hello, it's very nice to meet you, Monica, and I'm really happy to be here today for your inspirational but obviously also very emotional lecture. You can see from my surname that my ex-husband actually was tied up with the Bosnian situation, so he survived all of that, and it's painful to listen to, but it is important and very inspirational. So I was actually at Auschwitz and Birkenau a few years ago, Monica, and I found it to be one of the most disturbing moments of my life, but also one that I felt that, bizarrely, that I felt that literally every single person should go there to visit. You know, obviously they can't, but that's how it made me feel from my own visit. And the trauma actually of visiting there, I believe, will remain with me always. But before the pandemic, I was actually a professional singer for 30 years. And I'm now retraining, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, but I'm happy to be retraining as a journalist. So I'm really interested today just to ask you a very quick question, which is, because I live in Dunstan, near the Team Valley, I've noticed that is it your father who ran a company on the Team Valley? And how did that all come up, his life here? I heard you explain that he volunteered and he became a magistrate. He was involved with the Rotary Club. Did your father go on to be happy and settled in Gateshead, and what kind of business did he run?
Yes, I'll tell you all about that. That's a very good question, Sarah. Where the family business in Bamberg was an electrical engineering business. And when they were trying to get out of Germany in 1939, the British government had designated 2 areas in the UK for business development to do with war work. And one of those places was in Newport in Wales, and the other place was the very newly established Team Valley Trading Estate.
Right, okay.
So my grandfather and his brother Robert decided that they would come to the northeast because they were hoping that the family business that was handed over to a company in Bamberg might be able to trade again, and after it was all over. And of course, the Port of Tyne was the obvious place, rather than Newport, which was on the other side of the country. So they came to Gateshead, to Team Valley, and set up the family business. And it was there until my father sold it when he retired. And the whole family was in Gateshead. So, you know, my grandparents, Fritz and Elsa, came, and my father and his brother Ronnie came, and Daddy and Ronnie and my grandfather ran the business in the 1950s. And then my grandfather passed away in 56, so Daddy was only 30. And unfortunately, running concurrently with that time, my uncle Ronnie developed multiple sclerosis and became very ill, and eventually passed away in 1965. So Daddy was basically running the business single-handed at the time, but he continued all of his charitable businesses, or a lot of the charity work he was doing in Gateshead. He was on, I can't even remember them all, numerous. The Council of Social Services, he was a governor of John Haswell House, he was a governor of a special school. And then latterly, he became involved with the Women's Cancer Detection Service at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And for many years raised money there. Of course, he was also a Rotarian in Gateshead. And he got an MBE. I didn't put it in here because it was kind of, lots been spoken about Daddy's MBE, but he did get an MBE for his charity work, particularly with the WCDS, because he worked very hard to get a lottery grant. And in fact, the National Health Service used their equipment that they had paid for many years, until it all became up and running and state of the art at the QE.
Monica, you are an inspiration, and I'm so happy to be here and very honoured to be here today. Thank you very much. And having attended the QE at probably that very place, I am particularly grateful to hear the history of that. Thank you very much for sharing. Lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you. And I wish you well.
Thank you.
Monica,
Hello, good morning, Anne.
It's Anthony here. Hi.
Good morning.
A fascinating and very well done talk. Thank you very much indeed. George would be very proud that you are continuing the good work. Well done. Keep it up.
Thanks, Anne.
I think Robin has a question.
Hello there, Monica. Just that, what do you think about the present demonisation of migrants crossing the Channel?
Well, we are, absolutely, cognizant of their situation and their plight, because our families came here, under terrible circumstances. I mean, as you've heard, and as I'm sure you all know, their very lives were absolutely in danger, there is no doubt that many of the refugees are fleeing, for very good, when I say very good reasons, I mean for very appropriate reasons, because, their lives are in danger, and they wouldn't put themselves in that sort of danger unless it was very necessary. And I think that the government should, the British and the European governments should find some way of sorting out these poor people who, and picking up these traffickers, these people on the shores of, France, obviously at the moment, who are putting them in these tiny boats and putting their lives in danger. I think it's disgraceful, and something should be done. Yes, very sympathetic.
I think it's sort of like the same as what Hitler done. It's scapegoating. The economic problems we've got, I think it's similar, scapegoating.
Yeah, well, we hear a lot in the press these days, and the big difference between the Holocaust in the 1930s and the early 40s and today is the immediacy of social media. We hear about it all, and there are stories every day in the press about refugees and refugees who come here and are very desperate, and therefore they break the law, and that they're put up in terrible conditions and blah blah blah, which the world basically didn't know about in those days. And it is happening. It's very unfortunate. I think there's no doubt that some of the refugees are breaking the law, but maybe in desperation. Oh, I'm sure in desperation. And there's such huge numbers coming that I think the countries, find it very difficult to cope with them in an appropriate and decent way. Hi.
Thank you very much, Monica. You've brought it even closer to me, because actually I was in Vienna on Kristallnacht, as you know.
I do.
And I've learned a great deal from your talk today, though, which is not actually in my memory anymore.
Wow.
But
wow. And of course you were very friendly with Daddy as well. I know that you had a very good relationship.
We did have, yes. And also my sister-in-law sat on the bench with him. She was a gypsy and she knew him well, yes.
Right.
So thank you very much for your talk today.
Thanks, Kay. Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to ask Ian McCardle, one of the Littenfield's long-standing members, to give the vote of thanks on behalf of the Society.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
You can hear me, fine. I don't think the word I would use is to enjoy the talk. That would be very superficial, Monica. I think your talk has been essential, thought-provoking, harrowing in points. But one of the parts that I admired was the way you began by looking in a very objective, matter-of-fact way about the Jewish contribution, particularly, for example, in the First World War, when many Jewish soldiers paid the ultimate price for their Heimat, for Germany. And even when you were looking at the grim events from about 1930 onwards, you managed to present them still in a very matter-of-fact, unsentimental way. I was particularly struck by that comparison of the photos between Deutsche Jugend, German youth, and Jüdische Jugend, Jewish youth, and those mock photographs to show supposed differences that do not really exist. But after that first 10 minutes of your objective recounting of some of those facts, you then concentrated on your family. You became far more personal and subjective, and you introduced us to your father and the family, to Günther Loble, as he was known then. You talked about Kristallnacht, which for most of us, unless you have a personal contribution to it, is simply a historical fact. But you went beyond that, and in particular, your mention of the noises of the burning of the synagogue on Kristallnacht in Bamberg, I think, drove home to us the personal tragedies of so many tens, hundreds of thousands of individuals. But really, I want to congratulate you in two ways. One, the way that you and your family have been able to some extent to reconcile these ghastly events of the past and not dwell on the hatred that could so easily be the outcome. Your father made a very successful career, and I hadn't realized either that Loble on the Team Valley estate was your father's. It's, I think, an optical factory mainly.
No, it wasn't actually. My father also had a cousin, Herbert Loble, and
Right.
he was involved with Joyce Loble and Smith Electric Vehicles in the end. And
Yes.
our family business was called Loblite.
Right, okay, but obviously a very talented family, as so many of those German Jewish families were. There's actually a very interesting book in our library, if you go upstairs anytime, called Hitler's Gift. And what it is the huge number of talented, particularly scientists, nuclear scientists, that Hitler threw out of Germany. Had he kept them, of course, the outcome of the World War would have probably been very different. But what I want to say finally is that, yes, it's a tragic story, of course, that you must relate, but you also show inspiration, I think, as well, a way that people are able sometimes to overcome these tragic events and rebuild their lives and bury the hatred that so legitimately so many of them might well feel. I hadn't realized that there were, 200,000 Jews now live successful lives again in Germany. And of course, I wouldn't wish to forget that, of course, there were not only bad Germans in the Nazi period, though I'm thinking of people like Remarque, all quite on the Western Front, or Karl Zuckmayer, both of whom were, what's the word in English, exiled, ausgebürgert, and lived successful lives in the United States. Two of many, many others who saw the error, the tragedy of Germany in the 20th century. Thank you very, very much indeed for an inspirational and humbling talk in many ways. Thank you, Monica.
Very much. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Ian, and just a final thank you, Monica. Thank you from all of us here today. And as I said at the beginning, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days, and I will let Monica know when that occurs. So with that, good afternoon, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.